You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. Over the next hour, through their own words and archival audio, you will hear the story of D-Day and the contributions and sacrifices made by Miami Valley veterans on June 6, 1944. This program is dedicated to those men. My name is Todd Hollst. These are waves rushing Omaha Beach in Normandy, France. It's tranquil today, but 75 years ago, on the morning of June 6, 1944, that tranquility was broken by what would become the largest seaborne invasion in the history of the world. What transpired on these shores that day, and for many days and weeks after, opened and secured a second front of the war in Europe. Trudging through the water and sand and scaling steep cliffs while under fire, over 156,000 troops, including British, Canadian, Norwegian, and American fighting men, began the arduous task of liberating an entire continent from turmoil and the destructive grip of Adolf Hitler's Nazi war machine. The Battle of Normandy would be one of the most decisive engagements of the war and one of the most remembered. To comprehend the significance of the D-Day invasion and why the lives of so many Allied troops were put in harm's way, it's necessary to understand the short history of Hitler's rise in Germany. His seduction of the German people began in the early 1920s on the heels of their defeat in World War I. In 1921, Hitler's rise to power was taking off, having been elected leader of the Nazi Party, and years of economic hardship put Germany in turmoil. In 1930, promising a return to prosperity and peace, the Nazis became the second largest elected party in Germany. 3 years later, Adolf Hitler assumes absolute power. It was then the open assault of the Jewish people and others the Nazis found undesirable began. In 1934, through a confluence of world events, including the Spanish Civil War, the invasion of China by Japan, and his own lust for European dominance, Hitler reveals his plans for war to top Nazi officials. With their war machine built and ready, the Nazis mobilize in 1939, and their conquest of Europe begins.
Since the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, there have been only a few really momentous days in the history of Europe. Mussolini marching on Rome, Stalin launching his first five-year plan, Hitler breaking the bonds of Versailles one by one. Today comes another such mighty moment as Hitler's bond bursting finally carries Nazi expansion across the borders of Germany into the land of his birth. As officials pull down the frontier barriers, the political significance of these pictures is still too fresh in the minds of the world to need discussion. So without comment, we present the story of Germany's march into Austria, across the bridge over the river Salza into Salzburg.
Over the next several years, they invade over 30 European countries and territories, including Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, Italy, Denmark, Norway, France, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Greece, and Yugoslavia. The Nazis also invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, and by 1944, they're still fighting and struggling to take Russia. With the Eastern Front of the war consuming Hitler's attention, troops, and resources, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill realized there's an opportunity to attack the Nazis on the western doorstep of Europe. They all agreed the only way to end Hitler's brutal conquest would be through a massive coordinated invasion. For years, the two men, both pressured by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, wrangled over the details. With the United States fighting the Japanese in the Pacific following the attack at Pearl Harbor, resources were at a premium, and Roosevelt wasn't ready to fight a two-front war. Meanwhile, the Allies became engaged with Nazi forces in North Africa and then Sicily. This further delayed a European invasion. Finally, in May 1943, Operation Overlord, the name given to the overall large-scale plan to invade, began to take shape. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, named commander of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expedition Force in December of that same year, started preparing the Allied forces for an invasion. Every day, thousands of Allied troops, many of them American, and tons of supplies and ammunition started arriving in the countrysides and makeshift airfields of Great Britain. Training commenced at once. One man who heeded the call was Dayton native Vernon Miller, who passed away in December of 2018. Mr. Miller enlisted in the Navy the day he turned 17, and for 2 years served as a boatman's mate, helping maintain and repair naval ships. For the year prior to D-Day, Miller served on the USS Cincinnati, which escorted troop and equipment convoys from New York City to Belfast, Ireland in preparation for the invasion. His ship was one of around 6,900 vessels that supported the mission. In 2014, Mr. Miller talked to the Dayton Daily News about his service and the tenacity of the fighting men of which he served with.
Our motto of the ship was can do. Most of the people from 42 on, up until the war was over, the young people won the war, there's no doubt about it. We had people that told us what to do, but the younger people that went, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or whatever, they were just young and full of, excuse the word, pea and vinegar and everything like that, and they didn't give a hoot for nothing. So, that's what it took. So I think that's one reason that we were pretty well trained and we did our job.
With men and machines delivered to Britain and training for the mission underway, the Allied attack began to form. Commanders designated 5 beachheads along a 50 to 60 mile stretch of the Normandy coast where troops would be transported via the English Channel and deployed. The plan called for American infantrymen to enter at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, the British at Gold Beach and Sword Beach along with liberated French troops, and the Canadians at Juno Beach. But it wouldn't be easy. In the years prior, fearing an attack on the western flank, the Nazis forced nearly 1 million French workers to build a 1,600-mile seawall stretching from Norway along Belgium and France to the border of Spain. The Atlantic Wall, as it was referred to in German propaganda, was fortified with artillery batteries known as pillboxes, reinforced elevated structures which gave Nazi sharpshooters and machine gunners a great advantage over anyone encroaching the beach. Nazi troops also planted some 6.5 million mines on the shores and within the English Channel, along with other heavy and dangerous obstacles. Aware of the hazards the troops would face, Allied commanders prepared for a massive loss of life. Even though being warned the casualties could be as high as 75%, General Eisenhower saw no other alternative to the plan. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies went to great lengths to confuse the Germans. Fake invasion maneuvers with phony tanks and landing craft, fabricated radio transmissions, and even wooden dummy paratroopers dropped into France, helping preserve the element of surprise. Just over a month prior to D-Day, a rehearsal turned into a disaster for the Allies when one of the decoy ships was spotted by a German U-boat and torpedoed. 749 Allied fighting men lost their lives. On the eve of June 5th, with troops ready, aircraft fueled, and sailing vessels ready to launch, dour weather predictions forced a postponement. Allied air operations required clear skies so planes and paratroopers could see their landing targets. Naval vessels required low winds and calm water to safely transport troops and vehicles through the English Channel. And ground troops heading on shore needed a low tide so they could identify obstacles placed on the shoreline by the Nazis. The results could have been catastrophic if the mission launch took place in poor weather conditions. But 24 hours later, and right after midnight, June 6th, Operation Neptune, the code name given to this leg of Operation Overlord, was put into motion. The attack started with Navy battleship cannons and Air Force planes bombarding Nazi fortifications. The paratroopers followed, being dropped behind enemy lines to attack entrenched Nazis from behind. Then, the Allied infantry and armored divisions would come on shore. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, took to the airwaves and gave his troops their final mission charge.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
When we return, Dayton wakes up to the news of the invasion. And later, the role fighting men from right here in the Miami Valley play in the D-Day invasion and eventual victory in Europe. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Daytonians wake up to startling headlines. The Dayton Daily News exclaims, "Allies drive into France," while the Dayton Journal, in bold red letters across the front page, proclaims, "Continent invaded." An official communique from the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was the top story. The news detailed how the Allies, supported by naval and air forces, were at that very moment landing on the northern coast of Normandy. In the days that followed, people in Dayton turned to WHIO radio for live news reports on the progress of the campaign.
Flash, bulletin. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, June 6 AP. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters announced today that Allied troops began landing on the northern coast of France this morning, strongly supported by naval and air forces. The text of the communique, quote, "Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France." In 5 seconds, I hear we again will get an official report from London. Go ahead, London.
This is James Willard, speaking from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. I have just seen the first American troops preparing to storm ashore onto the continent of Europe. They were about to land on the north coast of France at 6:30 British summer time this morning. At 6:23, the Marauder bomber in which I was riding dropped the last load of bombs to be launched onto the coastal targets before H hour a few minutes later, when our landing barges would strike the shore. All night and from dawn onwards, thousands of Allied planes have been softening up a strip of coast. Already, several thousand paratroopers are waiting further inland to join forces with the landing parties. These airborne troops were flown in last night. I could see evidence of the landings in a number of parachutes lying in the little fields. But I must say at once, the amazing feature of my flight this morning was the almost unbelievable quietness of the scene below, where in the next few days, maybe in the next few hours, decisive battles for the reconquest of Europe will be fought.
On the evening of D-Day, people in Dayton and the rest of the country heard from the President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
President Roosevelt reveals the importance of his secrecy from a speech the night before, then leads the country in prayer.
My fellow Americans, last night when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another and greater operation. It has come to pass with success thus far. And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. For the enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph.
Coming up, boys and men from Dayton stormed the beaches and countryside of Normandy. You'll hear stories from and about members of the greatest generation from right here in the Miami Valley. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. A key element to the eventual victory in Normandy were the 22,000 Allied paratroopers, 13,000 of which were American, who were dropped behind enemy lines. This was a dangerous order, to be sure. Before the jump, Allied commanders estimated 8 out of every 10 paratroopers would not survive the mission, let alone the jump. Their role was to attack the Nazis from behind and take key bridges, towns, and passages, disrupting Germany's ability to send in reinforcements. The weather was better the morning of June 6, 1944, but not by much. Heavy fog and the lack of flight navigators were causing great miscalculations, and landing targets were being missed, often by miles. Allied troopers, with faces painted in black shoe polish and carrying almost 100 pounds of gear, leapt into darkness into the line of fire, their sole purpose, take the fight to the enemy. Greene County resident James Pee Wee Martin was a member of the famous 101st Airborne Division. Known as the Screaming Eagles, he was one of many who parachuted into Normandy the morning of D-Day ahead of the seaborne invasion.
The mission for my unit, 3rd Battalion of the 506 Parachute Infantry, 101st Airborne, was to take 2 bridges across the Douve River. The Germans had put those bridges in a few months before D-Day, and they were to bring reinforcements down to the beach forces, and it was imperative that they not be able to do that. So we captured the bridges because that's the way we are. We know no limits to what we can do. We're never taught there's a limit to what we can do. We do whatever we have to do with whatever we have.
But like many plans that day, they went out the window, and improvising became a tactic of necessity. Field radio equipment was lost during jumps, and communication was virtually impossible. Uncertain whether Mr. Martin's squad had survived the jump and secured the 2 bridges, Allied commanders made the tough decision to bomb the location instead. Martin told the Dayton Daily News in 2014, U.S. troops were still trying to take one of the bridges when bombers overhead started to drop their ordnance. He recalls one soldier being killed as a result of the friendly fire. It was and remains a reality of war, and according to Martin, it happened every day, and most never gave it a second thought.
Normandy was a savage and barbaric war. We were there 33 days. My battalion, when we jumped, we had 535 men in my battalion, and in 33 days we had 75 captured and 93 killed.
Many inexperienced Allied troops expected the Germans to be ruthless and to kill all prisoners, which made the fighting all the more urgent. Paratroopers were scattered throughout the French countryside, landing in marshes, ponds, farm fields, villages, and even trees. Don Jakeway of Johnstown, Ohio, was a member of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment with the 82nd Airborne. After leaping out of the door of a C-47 Skytrain troop carrier and narrowly avoiding anti-aircraft gunfire, his partially damaged parachute was snagged on a tree limb in a church courtyard, 10 feet short of the ground. In 2014, he told his story to the Dayton Daily News. Quote, "When we jumped there, we jumped everywhere we were not supposed to be. A trip into Normandy itself was quite an experience. When I landed in the tree, of course, I was scared to death because you didn't want to be caught in a tree." After regaining his composure, he pulled out his knife and cut his parachute lines. He hit the ground and immediately took off to hide in a hedgerow. He was alone, and with German troops lurking around, he slowly moved out from the area and started towards the sound of fighting. For 10 long days, he says it was a game of cat and mouse with German troops. At one point, he heard footsteps coming down a path, and he jumped over a wall, landing in a pile of manure. Staying out of sight, he heard German troops talking above him. Eventually, he regrouped with his unit, only to find 7 of the men he jumped out of the plane with didn't survive. As chaotic as it all was, Jakeway doesn't think they would have been nearly as successful if all the paratroopers had landed in the same place. The arbitrary landings made it difficult for the Nazis to track down Allied troops. Those who managed to find each other formed small pockets of resistance who were able to wreak havoc on German forces of similar sizes. As daylight broke on the Normandy coastline, American infantry began the assault on Omaha Beach and Utah Beach around 7 a.m. William Wilch, a former Middletown resident who died in 2016, was one of the first to land on Omaha Beach. In 2014, he told the Dayton Daily News when he hit the beach, he simply, quote, put his head down and ran straight ahead, unquote. He ended up in a bluff directly below where the Nazis were aiming their guns. The Germans shot at anything. Wilch also recounted to the Dayton Daily News how he thought the Germans were stunned by how the American fighting men stormed the beach and ran right into what for many was certain death. To Wilch's recollection, the American soldier didn't flinch. Quote, from what I smelled, heard, and seen, the D-Day assault where I was, the American soldier was magnificent. They went into death, hell. After going through being wet, sick, all that, they never hesitated. I never saw one man hesitate after he came out of those landing craft. Unquote. The vessels he's referring to, known as LCVPs or Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, were given the moniker Higgins boats after the man who invented them, Andrew Higgins. The boats were launched from ships several miles away from shore and carried the troops to the beach. General Eisenhower often credited Higgins as, quote, the man who won the war. Even Adolf Hitler recognized the contribution, calling Higgins the new Noah. Many people might recognize the boats in the opening sequence of the movie Saving Private Ryan. As the Higgins boats approached the shore, the bodies of the dead could easily be seen floating in the water. Some men were still alive and calling for help, but the boat captains were under strict orders to not stop and to continue to the beach as quickly as possible. After the several-mile trek through the English Channel, the door of the boat would open and expose the troops to Nazi machine guns. In some instances, entire boatloads of troops were gunned down before their boots even hit water. Over 12,000 Higgins boats were used on D-Day, each typically carrying 36 troops and a crew of 4. In all, over 132,000 troops were carried through the English Channel to the 5 designated landing zones in Normandy. Wallace Newcomb of New Carlisle died in February of this year at the age of 96. On June 6, 1944, he was a member of the famed 1st Infantry Division. As a U.S. Army private, Mr. Newcomb and his unit were among the first wave of troops to land on Omaha Beach. After taking the beach and several German strongholds, his unit was ordered to follow a German tank company and destroy it. D-Day plus 7, that's 7 days after D-Day, found Newcomb and his unit on the trail of a German Panzer tank. He told the Dayton Daily News on the 70th anniversary of D-Day in 2014, his greatest memory was that of the tank running over his arm. Quote, "We got real close to them. They stopped and were camouflaged, covered with brush. They were sitting still." Unquote. Then the tank began to fire. He added, quote, "When they had to move, I was right beside the tank, laying down with a machine gun, what they call a BAR, a Browning automatic rifle." Unquote. As the tank began to move, Newcomb's backpack became caught on the mechanism and began twisting him around. He was tossed into a position where the tank's tread ran right across his left arm. His saving grace that day, he credits, was the rain-soaked ground and the weight of the tank. It pushed Mr. Newcomb's arm into the sodden ground. His arm was still in bad shape, but he was able to keep it, and after a brief spell in a hospital in England, he was sent home and eventually became a carpenter at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Another Miami Valley veteran is Marion Adams. Today, he lives in Covington, Ohio, in Miami County. But on June 4th, 1944, he was a Navy radio man, first class, and serving on a ship transporting tanks and parts to Normandy Beach to the 101st Airborne. After delivering their supplies, his ship carried wounded troops and German prisoners back to England. During his time in Normandy, Adams made it to 4 of the 5 beaches, and he was tasked with recovering bodies from the water and the beach.
We got back to Gold Beach. We went in there, I was unloading, and there's a bomber come over, British, and everybody run for cover. I didn't run far, but I got to the hatch. I wanted to see that plane, and sure enough, he went over. And that's when I turned 21. I froze on the hatch that closed the door. I couldn't shut it, I couldn't open it, I couldn't run. Scared to no end, but that bomb went off about 200 feet behind her fantail. So he missed a good chance of making it through that. That beach was awful dry. The next morning, as the tide had been out, I went on to get off the ship, and it was sand. And the water was about 200 feet behind my ship. And I walked from where I got off all around to the rear of the ship, over to the other side, in the process of cleaning up bodies and pieces and parts. So that's when I decided I was lucky to have gotten through this far.
Coming up, the toll the Battle of Normandy exacts on Allied and American troops, and a salute to the veterans. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. You're listening to D-Day, Dayton Remembers, a radio special on 1290 and 95.7 WHIO, Dayton's News and Talk. We finish where we started, on the shores of Normandy at Omaha Beach. Without question, D-Day was the turning point of the war in Europe. The fight and vigor displayed by Allied troops, some from right here in the Miami Valley, turned the tide and started the great liberation of an entire continent from Nazi oppression. The price was high. Of the 4,400 Allied deaths on June 6th, American lives counted for 2,501 of them, more than half. The highest number of casualties happened here on Omaha Beach. 2,000 U.S. troops were either wounded, went missing, or killed. In all, 11,500 planes, 6,900 ships and landing craft, 50,000 vehicles, including tanks, and 156,000 men took back France from the Nazis, inch by inch, and then mile by mile. And blood was spilled nearly every step along the way. Nearly 3 months after the initial D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, Paris was liberated by the Allies after Germany surrendered the French capital on August 25th. This year we commemorate 75 years since the historic campaign and victory. And for many D-Day and World War II veterans, this will likely be the last significant remembrance they'll live to see. On average, 372 American World War II veterans die every day. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, of the 16 million Americans who served in the war, less than 500,000 are still alive today. In 10 years, it's estimated all veterans from the war will be gone. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan addressed veterans and families at the 40th D-Day anniversary in Normandy, France.
We stand today at a place of battle, one that 40 years ago saw and felt the worst of war. Men bled and died here for a few feet or inches of sand as bullets and shell fire cut through their ranks. About them, General Omar Bradley later said, "Every man who set foot on Omaha Beach that day was a hero." No speech can adequately portray their suffering, their sacrifice, their heroism. President Lincoln once reminded us that through their deeds, the dead of battle have spoken more eloquently for themselves than any of the living ever could. But we can only honor them by rededicating ourselves to the cause for which they gave a last full measure of devotion. Today, we do rededicate ourselves to that cause. And at this place of honor, we're humbled with the realization of how much so many gave to the cause of freedom and to their fellow man. Some who survived the Battle of June 6, 1944 are here today. Others who hope to return never did.
The grounds of Normandy are sacred. On a bluff at the Normandy American Cemetery, the final resting place of 9,388 servicemen can be found overlooking Omaha Beach. Among them, 45 pairs of brothers, 3 Medal of Honor recipients, 307 unknown soldiers, and a memorial called Garden of the Missing, where the names of over 1,500 American men declared missing in action are inscribed and remembered. Over 1,850 men from the Miami Valley gave their lives during World War II, their last full measure. On this day, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, let us all rededicate ourselves to remembering and appreciating the great sacrifices made that day and by all of our local veterans, no matter where or how they served. My name is Todd Hollst. Thanks for listening.